Well, it's speaking of being woke, it's early in the morning, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to match Sarah's level of enthusiasm, but I'm going to do my best. And thanks to Rod and Jeff for this invitation to attend this really impressive conference. Full audience. Here are my disclosures. So the first law of thermodynamics says that energy can't be created or destroyed. So applied to living systems gives us the familiar equation calorie intake minus expenditure equals calories stored, and since humans store most excess calories as fat, we can change the right side of that equation to change in adiposity. According to the conventional interpretation of this physical principle, obesity represents the personal failure to control energy balance. You heard this discussed yesterday in several talks, including by Gary Taubes. So, according to this way of thinking about obesity, this conventional interpretation, we live in this modern environment with ubiquitous tasty foods, certainly over the last half century. And these tasty foods cause us to passively overconsume, but we don't have enough opportunity to burn off those extra calories because our jobs are mostly sedentary, we don't exercise enough, and so those calories build up in the bloodstream as glucose, lipids, other fuels, and they get forced into fat cells, making them anabolic or making them grow. So the simple solution is eat less and move more. Of course, we've heard that 1,000 times. This conventional view places responsibility specifically on you, the individual, to control your energy balance. This is from my plate, the USDA. Reaching a healthy weight is a balancing act. The secret is learning how to balance your energy in and energy out. Now, if you like the energy balance approach to weight control, you've got to love the first food guide pyramid, because fat has more than twice the calories per gram or per bite of carbohydrate. So the thinking was that all fats would be unhealthy, both for the body, weight, and, as will be discussed in other talks, for cardiovascular disease risk factors, whereas carbohydrates were all inherently good. Now, it's really astounding to think that just 20 years ago, statements like these came from leading nutrition experts, society leadership, the Nutrition Society leadership, Obesity Society leadership. For example, one group said when people are allowed to eat from ranges of high fat or high sucrose, sugar foods, passive overconsumption only occurs with fat. It follows that fat promotes overconsumption while sugar probably prevents it. And a second group said the evidence intriguingly suggests that it is specifically an increased intake of sugars rather than complex carbohydrates that dilutes fat energy. So what this is saying is that these opinions, which were based on energy balance considerations alone, this concept of physics, that based on those considerations, all carbohydrates are going to be good, even sugar, and all fats are going to be bad. And that's exactly the advice the government gave to the food industry, calling for thousands of new processed foods, not fruits and vegetables, processed foods that were reduced in fat and saturated fat. And of course, if you're cutting those down, you've got to replace them with starch and sugar. So the food aisles filled up with fat-reduced foods such as these. Now, it's become popular today to argue that these low-fat junk foods were industry manipulation, trying to make profits, and public gullibility. But that represents a bit of revisionistic history in light of what we just saw. The government and nutrition establishment, the leadership, specifically proposed changes in the food supply that would create these foods. And as hoped, the proportion of calories increased from carbohydrate, from fat decreased, but of course the obesity epidemic emerged during this time period. We know that very few people with conventional approaches to obesity can successfully keep weight off for the long term. In this study, which was a nationally representative survey, 1 in 6 people could keep off just 10% of their excess weight, 10% of their body weight for just 1 year. So that's a dismal statistic. So we have to ask, why is this paradigm, which sounds so simple, just eat less, move a little more, just do it day after day and you'll ultimately achieve your goals. Why is this paradigm failed in practice? Well, an obvious problem is it completely disregards basically a century of research to argue that body weight is controlled by biology as much or more so than willpower, with a complex interplay of hormones, metabolic fuels, and other signaling integrating multiple hormones, multiple organ systems. So we know that the law of physics that says that calorie intake, expenditure, and fat storage are linked, that can't be wrong. That relationship is based on physics. But perhaps our assumptions about causal direction are at issue. So maybe the arrows don't move from left to right, but they move from right to left. Now, this in no way violates the law of thermodynamics either, but it has a profoundly different implication to the cause and potential treatments of obesity. So according to what could be termed the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, the problem begins at the right side of this figure. Something has triggered fat cells to take in and hold on to too many calories. So there are too few calories in the bloodstream, not too many, as in the other model. There are too few. The brain perceives that as an energy crisis. Not enough calories to run metabolism, to feed the brain, to satisfy the needs of the other organs in the body. And so that's why we become hungry and wind up overeating. And the brain, recognizing this potential metabolic problem, also lowers energy expenditure by making us fatigued and less likely to move, lowers resting energy expenditure, changes muscular efficiency. Now, if this model is true, then the advice to just eat less and move more will be doomed to failure and actually might make the problem worse because it's further going to restrict that already limited fuel supply circulating in the bloodstream. So what could be triggering fat cells into this calorie storage overdrive, this feeding frenzy? Well, of course, you've heard about insulin quite a bit in this conference so far. Insulin is the dominant anabolic hormone with regard to energy metabolism. It regulates the availability of all of the metabolic fuels. States of increased insulin action, not insulin levels per se, because we have to think of insulin resistance too, but states of increased insulin action with more secretion, or injection of insulin for somebody with type 2 diabetes, or insulin promoting secreting tumors, consistently leads to weight gain, whereas states of decreased insulin action consistently are associated with weight loss, such as undertreatment of a child with type 1 diabetes who can't make enough insulin. Without insulin treatment, that child with type 1 diabetes can eat 3, 5, 7,000 calories a day, but will continue to lose weight until getting back onto the right dose of insulin. And what could be increasing insulin secretion? Well, the type and amount of dietary carbohydrate. This is just endocrinology 101. The particular term of interest is glycemic load, which integrates both amount and type of carbohydrate and best predicts, better than either type or amount by themselves, better predicts how blood sugar and insulin will change after a meal or on a long-term diet. So let's take a look at some acute effects. So in this study, we gave Children, adolescents with obesity, one of 3 meals in a crossover fashion, so they got all 3 on different occasions. Basically, a vegetable omelet with fruit for the low glycemic load meal. The high glycemic load meal was instant oatmeal with a little milk and sugar. This was a low-fat, high, complex carbohydrate meal. The instant oatmeal had all of the fiber from the whole grain. It was just processed for instant cooking, so it digests very quickly. And then we also had a medium glycemic load meal of steel-cut oats, very much the same foods as in the instant oatmeal breakfast, but just processed differently, so the glycemic impact will be lower. And here's what we saw in terms of hormones. Looking the x-axis, horizontal, shows time from the meal for 5 hours. So that's through the late postprandial state. And as expected, insulin rose more after the instant oatmeal in yellow compared to the steel-cut oats in red or pink and the vegetable omelet in blue. But another hormone, which Ben Bickman speaks eloquently about, is oftentimes neglected, which is glucagon. Glucagon is made from cells right next to insulin-producing cells, and it does the opposite of insulin. Insulin promotes storage, whereas glucagon prepares the body to release calories from storage. It pulls calories out of storage. So glucagon was actually suppressed after the high glycemic load meal. So that results in an extremely high ratio of insulin to glucagon. That's going to be a metabolic double whammy that's going to direct the calories coming in from the meal into the liver, into muscle, into fat. But a few hours later, after those calories from the digestive tract have been absorbed and you need to access them from their stored locations, the persistent effects of these hormones are going to lock them down for a while. It's going to prevent the liver from releasing glucose, and it's going to prevent fat cells from releasing fatty acids. And as a consequence, we see this, which is that glucose, after that initial surge, after the high glycemic index meal, comes down into a relatively hypoglycemic range. That was statistically significant difference. And free fatty acids, which are a key fuel in the late postprandial stage and in the fasting state, were also suppressed more. The body recognizes this as a metabolic crisis, secreting epinephrine, an emergency stress hormone, in higher amounts after the high glycemic load meal rather than the medium or low. And when we gave subjects free access to food, they consumed hundreds of extra calories because, again, consistent with this notion that the brain is seeing a metabolic problem. So same calories at baseline, and in the case of the 2 oatmeals, the same carbohydrate, just different rates of digestion, but very different hormonal and hunger states a few hours later. So what could be happening in the brain at this time? A study that was conducted by Belinda Lennertz, and you'll be getting the opportunity to hear from her tonight, looked at 12 men who had high BMI in a double-blind fashion. We gave them milkshakes that looked alike, had similar sweetness, in a randomized crossover fashion. In fact, the same macronutrients, same protein, fat, and carbohydrate, but one milkshake had corn syrup, which is about as high glycemic impact as you can get. The other had uncooked cornstarch. So it comes from the same plant, still corn, but because uncooked cornstarch is a tough little molecule that doesn't digest quickly, it has a much lower glycemic impact. And we saw that when we followed blood sugar curves after the meal. The high glycemic index milkshake led to a higher blood sugar response. Note, though, that at 4 hours after the meal, on the right side, despite the same calories, the same carbohydrate, people reported being significantly hungrier after the high glycemic index milkshake. And at that time, so the late postprandial period, many studies are done just at 1 hour when blood sugar is surging. Okay, if you eat a bagel and fat-free cream cheese and orange juice for breakfast, you might be feeling fine 1 hour later. But that's not really the key issue. The key question is, how are you going to be feeling 3, 4, and 5 hours later when you may either have an extra snack, an extra large snack, or overeat at the next meal? The late postprandial state is key, and it's rarely examined. We looked at it here. This is brain activation by a form of functional magnetic resonance imaging at 4 hours. And we found that one area consistently lit up more so after the high glycemic index milkshake than the low. That area, called the nucleus accumbens, is considered the classic seat of the major addictions: cocaine, heroin, alcoholism, gambling, raising a provocative possibility that these highly processed, quick-digesting carbohydrates hijack basic pleasure and reward systems in the body, producing something that could legitimately be called food addiction. All right, all studies in humans are going to be inevitably confounded by one factor or another, which is a motivation to occasionally go to animal research to understand basic nutritional principles. I think there's too much animal research on diet because, mice are not men. But I think there are specific questions that can be productively addressed, and we attempted to do so in this study, which is that we took rats who were at risk for type 2 diabetes and gave them, again, identical diets, same protein, fat, and carbohydrate, but just varied the glycemic index from fast digesting to slow digesting. And we further maintained body weight the same between the two groups by pair feeding. An argument could have been, well, maybe the fast digesting carbohydrate is tastier, and so the rats just overate it. So we wanted to factor that out. And then we measured body composition at 18 weeks by radioactive hydrogen water. And here's what we found. So on the left, you can see the curve of body weight between these two groups over 18 weeks. And I think you'll agree that we kept weight basically the same between the two groups, really no evidence of any difference in body weight. But to do that, we had to begin to restrict calories in the high glycemic index group at around 8 weeks. What does that mean? See, these two groups the high glycemic group started gaining more weight on the same calories. So what does that mean about its metabolism? It was slowing down. That animal was becoming more metabolically efficient, slowing down its metabolism, so we had to cut back its calories. We had to put it on a diet. Same thing that is told to people who are gaining weight excessively. So we gave it fewer calories to achieve the same body weight, and we succeeded in doing that. And despite that, the high glycemic index animals still had much more body fat. And since they had more body fat at the same weight, they had less lean tissue, muscle, and organ mass. Now, this is fortunately not after lunch. This will be the only graphic slide I'll show you. These two animals weighed the same. The one on the left that ate the low glycemic index diet had very little visceral fat and was metabolically healthy based on blood tests. The one on the right was a metabolic mess with the highest risk fat. This finding completely defies the calorie balance, all calories are alike view of obesity management. The animal on the right was gaining too much weight. We put it on a diet, we successfully prevented weight gain, and it still was at major metabolic risk. Okay, what about chronic effects in humans? There are 5 meta-analyses that consistently show low-fat diets, counter to hypothesis, are inferior to all other higher-fat diets. Now, the differences here are not great. There are a couple of kilos typically, but these are mostly low-intensity behavioral studies with poor compliance. So it doesn't say what you could do if you got an intensive intervention such as the one Sarah described earlier. So there are many specific predictions of the carbohydrate insulin model for which we have at least some evidence. High-fat versus lower-fat diets produce more weight loss. High glycemic load foods like sugary beverages, refined grains, and potatoes are associated with more weight gain than high-fat foods, such as olive oil, nuts, dark chocolate, and full-fat dairy. There's effect modification by something called insulin secretion. We'll come back to that. Reduced metabolic fuel concentrations in the late postprandial phase after high glycemic load meals. Altered fuel partitioning, and, at least in animals, increased body fat accumulation on energy-controlled high glycemic index or load diets. So one big area of controversy is whether there are calorie-independent effects on energy expenditure. This model predicts that at the same number of calories going in, or better yet, at the same body weight, you're burning more, your calorie burn will be greater on a low-carb diet. That's a metabolic advantage. Now, I think some popular low-carb diet books made excessive predictions about this, 600-800 calories. You know, if it were that big, we would have seen it by now. But if there are effects in the range of 1 to 300 calories, that would still be extremely important scientifically and very important clinically, but harder to see in little trials. Now, one of the chief critics of this model published a meta-analysis that looked at studies of low versus high-carb diets on energy expenditure and said there's no difference. And thus, the carbohydrate insulin model is falsified. But there's a big problem with this meta-analysis. The median length duration of these studies is less than 6 days. Okay, so why, so people laughed about that. So this group understands a basic principle that the physiological adaptations to a low carbohydrate diet don't occur immediately. How do we know that? Well, just look at fasting. That's one of the most potent stimuluses for ketogenesis. Beta-hydroxybutyrate takes 3 weeks or more to reach steady state. Look at, 6 days. See where 6 days would be? You're barely half the way there. And the same is true for low versus high-carb diets. This was a weight-reducing, low or high-carb diet. By 1 week, you're barely half the way to steady state ketones. And so if you're habituated to a high carbohydrate diet and you suddenly are put on a low carbohydrate diet, your brain was reasonably happy within limits that we've discussed with the glucose that is provided on that high carbohydrate diet. Now you've just shut off the glucose supply. We know that's not going to be a problem long term because ketones rise and serve as an alternative fuel. But what happens during those first few weeks when you've turned off the glucose, but yet your ketones haven't reached steady state? How do you feed the brain? From your muscles. So you've got to break down some protein for gluconeogenesis temporarily. And we see that in this study, nitrogen balance, which is reflecting muscle amino acids, is more negative. This is not a big deal. It means that when you start a low-carb diet, and this might be modifiable a little bit based on how much protein you consume, but you can expect to lose about a pound of lean mass as you adapt. That has no implications to long-term, because by 1 month, we're back to balance. But it means if you study people at 3 days, 6 days, 9 days, or 12 days, they're going to look like a metabolic mess. And of course, you're not going to necessarily see optimal long-term chronic effects. Extensive research documenting that this adaptation process to a low-carb diet takes a while. So we need longer studies, and that's in fact the purpose of this recently published research we did called FS2, published in the BMJ in November. And the aim was to evaluate the effects of 3 diets varying in carbohydrate to fat ratio on energy expenditure, calorie burn, over 5 months in a well-powered study. This was the design. We had a run-in phase and a test phase. The run-in phase was weight loss. We brought people's weight down by about 10%, at least 10%, to put the body under some stress. We know that with weight loss, energy expenditure is going to drop, people are going to be hungry, the body's going to want to regain weight. Then we randomly assigned them to high, moderate, or low carbohydrate diets. We collected data before weight loss, right at the start of the trial, before randomization, at 10 weeks, and at the end of the study, 20 weeks. We had 164 participants. This contrasts to the 8, 10, 12 participants in most feeding studies. We had 162 of them were the intention to treat analysis, and 120 were in the per protocol analysis. Those are the people whose weight during that weight maintenance phase remained stable. And I should say, during this weight maintenance phase, we adjusted calorie intake to keep their weight the same. So if somebody's metabolic rate went up and they started losing weight, we would have given them more calories, and the opposite would have occurred. Our aim was to keep everybody's weight within 2 kilograms, and we were able to do that for the per protocol for most of the people. This shows the participant characteristics. Mean age was about 38. They had a BMI on average of 32. Mostly women, as is the case for, usually the volunteers for nutrition studies are mostly women, but we had pretty good ethnic variability. These are the test diets. High carbohydrate, moderate and low, 60, 40, 20% carb. Reciprocal relationship with fat, 20, 40, 60%. Protein was controlled at 20% on all diets. The primary endpoint was total energy expenditure, total calories burned by a technique called doubly labeled water, where you give these stable isotopes and you just follow you get urine samples. And then what do you do with those urine samples? You put them in a fancy mass spec machine. Our collaborator in Texas, Bill Wong, did this. And you can see decay curves of how deuterium or O18 decay over time. And the rates of those decay tell you, based on the physics of this, metabolic rate. So I'm going to skip over this. This is the primary outcome. You'll see the time zero on the left, 10 weeks and 20 weeks. The panel on the left was the full intention to treat. The panel on the right were those who presumably had the best compliance, their weight stayed stable. And we found a highly statistically significant difference among diets, that at the same body weight, those on the low-carb diet were burning about 200 to 280 calories a day more than those on the high-carbohydrate diet. Now, if this is real, this is important. This is a provocative finding, that the type of calories you consume affect the number of calories you burn, implying that a focus on carbohydrate restriction could be more effective than a focus on calorie restriction. And this is a little bit complicated. It's my last data slide on this. I'll just walk you through it briefly. The carbohydrate insulin model predicts that those who are high insulin secretors, so for whatever genetic reasons or early life influences or sedentary behaviors, for whatever reason, some people secrete more insulin when they consume carbohydrate, in this case an oral glucose tolerance test, than other people. So if you're a high insulin secretor, you're going to be especially susceptible to the metabolic adverse effects of high carbohydrate diet. And so we just divided people according to tertiles, groups of 3. That group of 3 on the right, those are the ones with the highest insulin secretion before they started the study. Middle group was medium, and the group on the left have low insulin secretion. So what this shows is that if you're a high insulin secretor, you are indeed especially sensitive with this 478 calorie difference between the low and high carbohydrate diet. If you're in the middle group, that difference is smaller and just borderline significant, 248 calories. If you're a low insulin secretor, there's very little difference, not even statistically significant. One size may not fit all. You know, when somebody says, listen, I cut out fat, I ate a low-fat vegan diet, and I did great. Well, you know, that could be true. But, you know, the people who cut back on fat during the 80s and 90s and gained massive amounts of weight and developed type 2 diabetes, I mean, those are the ones that are showing up in your office, and those are probably enriched in that right tertile. So this study has a number of strengths listed here. The main limitation is the possibility of non-adherence. And our sensitivity analysis, because we fed people all of their meals, but we didn't follow them 24 hours a day. And it's possible that people on their own ate other things or didn't eat all of what we gave them. So, you know, I guess you know you're doing potentially important work when your critics aim to aggressively attack your work. And we've had these attacks. One was our choice of baseline. And so our chief critic, so we used as the baseline the time right before randomization for the comparison of the diet effects. But our chief critic said we really should have used the pre-weight loss baseline. And you know, when the analysis is done that way, the effects are smaller. But that's not really surprising. People lose weight in different ways. Some people lose more fat, some people lose more lean. The further away you go from randomization, the more noise there's going to be. So that's really not surprising. Virtually all dietary weight loss maintenance studies use the time point right before randomization, such as in the Diogenes study, which is the largest diet study ever done to address this issue. You can see that the baseline was after weight loss and just before they put on the diets. And incidentally, this shows a very consistent effect. Most weight regain on the high glycemic load diet, least on the low glycemic load diet. So many studies have been done using this pre-randomization time point, so I think we can cross off that concern. Another was randomization failure. You know, randomization is supposed to take into account variability between people, but, you know, you could have imbalances. There is the complaint that weight instability, refeeding could confound the findings, but there was really no difference in weight between groups. The overall weight change during baseline was very small, 23 grams. That easily fits within the definition of weight stability, which is less than 250 grams a day. So I think we can cross that one off. Validity of double-labeled water has been challenged. Now, this is a gold standard technique, but some people have, our chief critic has argued that de novo lipogenesis on a high-carb diet could confound doubly labeled water. So what is that? Well, glucose comes down to acetyl-CoA and then can be built back up into triglycerides through de novo lipogenesis, and that can trap deuterium. So the argument was that, well, maybe this could bias the study by 30 to 60 calories a day. That's not the whole effect, but, you know, that could be significant. This concern comes from studies of pigs gaining 1.5 pounds a day during their most rapid growth rate. Even among the pigs, at weight stability, there was no bias. And our study was done at weight stability. So the critics have to postulate a huge amount of futile cycling, going back around and around and around in order to come up with this estimate. And we're short of time, but I'll basically just say that there's no evidence for such high levels of de novo lipogenesis on weight-stable diets that aren't loaded with sugar. In fact, the amount of de novo lipogenesis is in the range of about 5 grams a day or less. And in fact, there's concern that the other method, the method preferred by our critics, whole room calorimetry, is actually less accurate because it restrains physical activity level, which is a mechanism through which diet can affect total energy expenditure. If you're eating foods that help you feel better, you're more likely to move and to be active. And if you're constrained in a small chamber, well, that could miss the effect. And the last thing I want to show you is address the criticism that the effect is mostly due to non-adherence, that people were just eating other foods, and that's going to artificially inflate TEE. If the results of our study are real, then the number of calories we're giving people at weight stability should roughly equal the number of calories they're burning off, at least as a group average. So we presented preliminary data in our manuscript on this, and the direction of effect was consistent, but these were preliminary, imprecise data, and we didn't see statistical significance. So we've been motivated to go back, review all of the food production sheets, determine calories consumed, and then calories provided on the test diets, and then adjust for differences in fat mass. And these are new data, hot off the press. You're the first group seeing it. So this is on the left, the average number of the difference between the groups of calories provided on the 3 diets. And on the right, it's adjusted for changes in fat mass. And you can see that there's the same relationship between high, moderate, and low as we saw for total energy expenditure. These effects, in other words, to maintain body weight, we gave the low carbohydrate group about 350 calories more. So that strongly suggests that our primary total energy expenditure finding is not artifactual because there's such close consistency. All right, so I think we can argue now that there is at least some evidence for calorie-independent effect. The carbohydrate insulin model, I do want to point out, is more than just a single hormone and a single nutrient. Many components of the diet affect fat storage, either through insulin or independently, as do sleep, stress, and physical activity. So this becomes an intellectual infrastructure for understanding how biology could influence fat storage beyond just the energy balance view, which focuses on willpower. Okay, I'm going to skip over type 1 diabetes because I think we're out of time, but fortunately, Belinda Lennertz is going to be presenting this study tonight of a low-carb diet for people consuming type 1 diabetes. And will conclude with this thought, that the ideas implicit in the carbohydrate insulin model may seem provocative, at least compared to the conventional perspective, but they're not new. A leading researcher wrote that the current energy theory of obesity, which considers only an imbalance between intake and expenditure, is unsatisfactory. An increased appetite with a subsequent imbalance between intake and output of energy is the consequence of the abnormal Anlage. That's a German term for amount of fat tissue. It's a consequence rather than the cause of obesity. And this statement was made by Julius Baer in 1941. Thank you for your attention.